Good morning. It's Sunday the 8th of November, and this Sunday is the Sunday closest to the 11th of November, which is Remembrance Day in the United Kingdom and many parts of the world, marking the end of the First World War, and then traditionally a day for remembering all those who've died in war, where the focus has changed over years, where it used to be much more about combatants, and then particular combatants on the side that was victorious and was fighting against that which was deemed evil, but latterly a day that has come to be a deep day of gratitude and a deep day of mourning for many people as we think about the effects of war on the world, on human relationships, on families, on nations, the deep scars and wounds and identity issues that arise because of how we call ourselves or call others good or evil, friends or enemies. Jesus, speaking in the recorded writings of the author of John's Gospel, John chapter 15. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing, but I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask him in my name. I am giving you these commands, so that you may love one another. Because of coronavirus, there aren't a lot of poppies around in the same way that we would normally have had poppies for sale, poppies being worn, poppies in public. Most of them red poppies, although alternatives are available. And in recent years, in fact for a very long time, white poppies have been available since the 1930s. White poppies have been available as a way of remembering the tragedy of war without using the means of war to glorify the remembering of war. So some years ago I was chaplain to the Sheriff of York. The Sheriff is an honorary title that mostly involved some slap-up dinners and some ribbon cutting and other things, but I was chaplain to the Sheriff. And I went along with Brian to a number of events. I stood in for the Mayor of York's chaplain at the Remembrance Day service at the War Memorial near the Railway Museum and the train station in York itself. One of the military chaplains and I led parts of that service. And I got to be standing facing all those who had gathered public, rather than standing in the midst of that crowd looking towards the memorial over the backs of people's heads. And so I got to see all the faces of those who'd gathered. The military chaplain had warned me that when the moment came when they would fire the cannon, and they properly fired a cannon, that I should expect it to be a shock. And it was. It was, even though I expected it, loud and frightening. But as I looked out across the crowd, I saw lots of men wearing medals, men who had clearly fought in combat, and men who bore the scars of that in their hearts, never mind their bodies, in their souls, in their psyches, perhaps in their relationships. I saw their reactions to the sound of a cannon. I saw how terrified some of them were. I saw how hard they tried to remain solid and steely and resolved. I saw, in a number of cases, I saw their wives or their partners clutching their arms even more fiercely, putting an arm around them and holding them in the moments beyond that very loud bang. War does terrible things. And so some people, I'm one of them, choose to wear a white poppy as part of not just saying that war is a terrible thing, but even questioning the way that we go about fighting, and the way we go about deciding to fight, and the way we go about assuming that violence, that war is inevitable and part of humankind's evolving story. Necessarily so. Now that doesn't take away anything from the remembering of those who have given their lives, who've died, many throughout history, conscripts, not people who volunteered, but people who were signed up. against their will sometimes, to go and to bear arms. It's a messy business. And remembering it should never be simple. And that's part of what a white poppy is trying to say in all that a red poppy means, and perhaps a little bit more. And then recently there have been other colours of poppies arrive on the scene. Purple poppies, which you may not have seen many of, but purple poppies that are about remembering the cost to the natural world of warfare. Not just the fact of, in the First World War, literally several million horses going across the Channel, hardly any of them returning. But the way that animals have been just assumed into the state of violence that is war, the way that the natural world has been desecrated by the histories of the wars that have ravaged across the landscape, and also the ongoing impact of that in the way that war leaves its scars and they heal slowly. And then I was grateful to a friend of mine who introduced me some years ago to black poppy. She is herself a black woman, and she introduced me to the black poppy, which is part of a campaign to make sure that people of colour, people who are minorities, people who are not obviously white British people or white anybodies necessarily, who have been at the centre of certainly the great wars, the two great wars of last century in Europe, that they are not forgotten. Where they have for a time were willfully excluded from remembrance, from parades, from memorials, from the telling of that story. That situation is being redressed and has been in many cases. But there are forgotten people who are worthy to be soldiers, even though they are deemed or have been deemed in the past to be somehow less human. See, when Jesus says in John's Gospel, when he says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another," he says an incredibly profound, painful, challenging and committing thing. We are not to decide which poppy is better. We are not to say which one is somehow expressing the real meaning of remembrance. I've had that conversation with a number of people simply because I was wearing a white poppy. I got spat on once in the city because I had a white poppy on. It's a long time ago. We're not in a position to say that one is better than the other. But it does matter that we say things about violence and about war and about the width and breadth of the implications of what it means to fight. Would wearing all four poppies, would that somehow diminish each of them? I don't know. Some people would say absolutely. Some people would say yes. Some people would say definitely not. Wearing all four would give us a bit of a rainbow of reflecting, and the fact of the complexity of human society, never mind the complexity of violence. We think back not very long to protests in America and elsewhere. Black Lives Matter. Statues of slavers pulled down. Questions about what legitimate storytelling looks like, and how we are reminded of where we've come from, and what glorifies slavery in the telling of it, what glorifies war in the telling of it. And those are very careful conversations to have. They can be very emotive. We've seen that. So yes, Black Lives Matter. Yes, police lives matter. Yes, all lives matter. Yes, whoever's life you want to add into that, it matters. But today's a day on which we perhaps particularly stop, like the Black Lives Matter campaign asked us to stop and reflect on one part of our life, one part of our world where things are broken. One group of people, one assumption we make, one set of values we expound and put into statute that do deliberate harm, that do perhaps harm that is not intentional but is far-reaching, and that we can't turn away from just because we didn't know it would happen. If it sounds like for a moment I'm saying Black Lives Matter shouldn't stand on its own, I'm not at all. But there is something greater than the small focus of the moment. And however you want to remember today, the fact of the violence of our nation and others. However you want to take part in remembrance, pause for remembrance, celebrate remembrance, mourn the fact of remembrance, there is something larger at play. And it is caught up in these words that Jesus preaches. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Well, let's not be sentimental about those words, because we know elsewhere that Jesus says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. In a sense, lay down your life, not just for your friend, but lay down your life in front of those who would trample on your life. Not in order to be trampled, but because you can always have the capacity in you to choose something that is more of the kingdom of God than perhaps the best you know and the best you found as a human race, or you found individually in your response to someone who is disrespecting you, someone who is threatening you, someone who is wanting to dominate you in some way. Remembrance is a huge, huge open wound for many families, for many people. The stories that are the real stories of what life was like for those who fought in any of the wars that have been fought at any point in our human history, those stories are seldom glorious, and they always leave a lifetime of work to do, physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, in relationships, in forgiveness, in memories, in fear, in anger. Today is a difficult day. It's difficult for many reasons. For many people, those reasons are very different. And I am not going to begin to say that Remembrance Day should be about one thing in particular, one group in particular, one conflict in particular, one period of history in particular, one way of remembering in particular. But I do want to ask you to think about what might stop this cycle of needing to remember. Not for that which has already passed, necessarily, but for that which is yet to come, that will just heap more of the same complexity, pain, suffering, and brokenness in the world. What might you do? What might I do? Who might we be and become? For those of us in the church, perhaps most powerfully because of the God that we love and serve, God who is one and God who is love. How might you and I perhaps remember better, perhaps work harder, perhaps engage more with the unfairness, the anger, all the things that we see in our world that lead to conflict, that lead to violence, that lead to the sadness of today, the tragedy of today, and all that it means to, however proud we might feel as individuals or as a country, live with loss, live with less, live with the fact of stories we wish had never needed to be told or remembered, in words or in silence. So travel well through today, whatever it means for you, in your own story, in your family story, in our nation's story, in the world's story. Red poppies matter, white poppies matter, purple and black poppies matter. Black lives matter, police lives matter, white lives matter, all lives matter. All these things are true. It is right and good that at certain times we stop. We stop and we narrow our focus and ask, what is it about this part of our being human together that needs us to do work the most, for some or for all? And today is one of those days. So bless you as you go through today, whatever your feelings around it will be. I'll be back on Monday for another week's reflections, Monday to Thursday, just brief reflections in the morning. But for today, for Remembrance Sunday, for remembrance day as it comes on Wednesday, we pause, we lament, we give thanks, we see what might be different in the future, and how you and I, how we might be part of that, how we might be part of a more hopeful, less violent, more loving world, knowing that there will always be hard work, not just some soppy sentimentalism that says everything is okay. Bless you. Have a peaceful day.